Hey everyone, I am standing here in the gym hallway next to the portraits of former ministers here at St. Andrews. And one of them that I've been drawn to is this fella here. I think maybe we'll get you a shot of it so you can see him for real. But his name is Captain Reverend Young. And I like his portrait for a few reasons. One is that these are pretty serious people up here, and I know that the Christian life is serious business. But Captain Reverend Young has a bit of a knowing smile, as if he knows what's up. The second thing is that he is a captain, which I think is just the coolest thing. You had to pay attention during his sermons, or else. And then the third thing is that when we show you the picture, maybe you'll see he was actually absent from the charge here at St. Andrews during the Second World War. So he served before, he went over to fight or do whatever he did, and then he came back and continued to be the pastor here. Let's think about, just for a second, what lasting impact Captain Reverend Young had here at St. Andrews. And I don't want to disparage his ministry at all. But the Bible tells us every so often to have a clear and sober look at where we derive meaning from our lives for. And now when we probably have a bit of time on our hands is as good as any. So let's examine maybe Captain Reverend Young for a second, and then we will turn to examine what the scriptures say, and we'll examine our own lives. I confess, everybody, that I don't know really anything of what he did during his time here. I don't deny his ministry was important. I don't deny he probably led people to know Jesus in a deeper way. But if Captain Reverend Young was looking for personal significance in his accomplishments and what he could do and what he could achieve, unfortunately, time and probably his own passing has made that a foreclosed option. Captain Reverend Young's life was no doubt important because he walked with his Maker. He was a child of God. He knew the Lord's presence throughout his life. But if he wanted to make a mark on this world for himself and to make a name for himself, I work at the church and I've been around here for a few years now, and I confess, perhaps to my embarrassment, that I know very little of what he accomplished during his time here. In our next scene, we're going to turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, which is one of these books that helps us to have a sober assessment of our lives. Not a joyless assessment, and that is important. Just one where we think, what really gives our life meaning? How do we walk with our Maker in a way that makes sense to us? How do we stop chasing the wind and get down to the real business of knowing our God and loving our neighbor? I don't know if you've ever got an email forward, a joke or whatever that someone you know has sent to you. The book of Ecclesiastes is kind of like the ancient Near East equivalent of these email forwards. The book is written by a father, and it's sent to his son, and the father tells the son, pay attention to the words of this teacher that I've found interesting. And the book is largely a recording of what this person, the teacher, has said, and the father says to the son, read this. The teacher in the book of Ecclesiastes, he's a little bit of a philosopher, which is good and bad. It's bad in the sense that he, kind of goes on and on and on and on before he finally gets down to saying what he really wants to say. But the fact that this book is included in the scriptures means that maybe we want to take some time to unpack and understand what was so important that the God of the whole universe thought that we should have this book in our Holy Scriptures. I want to trace the argument of the philosopher in the book of Ecclesiastes for you, and then we'll think about what his argument means for our day-to-day lived experience in the Christian life. The philosopher in the book of Ecclesiastes says that a lot of the things that we think give us meaning maybe are not as strong, or maybe, they're a bit shallow. Maybe we could think better and know more deeply about what gives our lives meaning. He thinks that things like wealth, things like knowledge and understanding, things like achievements and accomplishments seem to give our life meaning, but are in fact hollow pursuits. And he addresses each one in turn. The first one he addresses is wisdom. And he says, there's a time for everything under the sun. Get wisdom if it's available to you. But he notices something very interesting. He says that people who are wise and people who have a lot of knowledge and understanding, evil people still spring up and create unjust situations. People who are wise and knowledgeable still have very little control over what happens in this world. And so the teacher says, get wisdom and understanding, but wisdom and understanding in itself is not meaningful. It's like chasing after the wind. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but what can you do sometimes to change any of your circumstances? He also does the same approach with wealth. He says there's a time for everything under the sun, a time to buy things and a time to sell things and get wealth if you can. But he says that sometimes wealth has a way of obscuring our knowledge of God. He says that having wealth doesn't help us to understand our Maker and the Creator of the universe. And he even says that people who have wealth sometimes can't enjoy it. They're so worried about accumulating more that they just miss enjoying even the wealth that they have. So for similar reasons, he says, wealth seems like something that's important, but it is also, in fact, like chasing the wind. Finally, the teacher talks about what we can achieve or what we can accomplish in our lives. And once again, he says, there's a time for everything. There's a time to build things up and a time to tear things down. But he says, finally, whatever you achieve with your life, it's going to be forgotten in the face of time and in the face of death. And whatever you've achieved in this life will, pass away at some point, and then someone else will come along and achieve exactly what you've achieved, but even do it better. At the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, the philosopher says, so wealth and knowledge and achievement, important, but let's dig deeper. What is truly meaningful in our lives? And then he says, at the end, he says, know that you are created. That life is not, a solo sport. Life is not about achieving the person that you want yourself to be, but life is in fact about humbly walking with your Maker. Life is about communion. Life is about encounter with a God who made you and loves you and walks with you day by day in your moment-to-moment life. Everyone, the author of Ecclesiastes says it's good to think about death. So here we are in the graveyard, and Peter and I thought we'd have a little conversation about where does meaning come from in another one of our unscripted sessions here. Peter, what's something that you've accomplished that time has diminished, and what does that make you think about meaning?
So I published a book in 2008 called In Dying We Are Born. We talk about a graveyard, In Dying We Are Born.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a big publishing house, but it made their top 10 bestsellers for 6 months.
Yeah.
So that's big news. Hey, I was on a bestseller list. That's pretty cool. 12 years ago.
12 years.
And some people ask me, so when's the next book coming? There's been no next book. So, pretty meaningless, right? It mattered 12 years ago. It felt pretty cool 12 years ago. The last royalty check I got from that book, $3.35.
Wow, you're making it, eh?
So, yeah, time does diminish substantially what we think of as important and what's significant. Changes with time.
For me, I think 5 years ago, Nissa and I set out to paddle from Kapuskasing to James Bay. And we had tried a few years before, and it failed. That's a story for another time. But for me, that was like a big accomplishment, this 2-week-long trip. And these days, I barely ever think about it, actually. It's just something that happened, and I'm looking forward to what's next. The teacher tells us that wisdom is good to have, and you and I are booky people, a little nerdy. I want to think that knowing things is important, but he tells us it isn't. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I like to think, I like to read, I like to do those things. But one of my favorite movies is the movie The Breakfast Club. And in The Breakfast Club, Brian Johnson is the nerd.
Yeah.
And why has he got detention? He's got detention because he tried to kill himself with a flare gun, which is a very stupid thing to try to do. But anyways, why was he trying to kill himself? Because he took shop class because it was going to be an easy A, and he couldn't build a little lamp and make it work. So there's different kinds of knowledge. Those of us who are intellectuals look down on those who work with their hands and say, that's not meaningful. I'm not so sure of that. Knowledge comes from a lot of places, from a lot of sources. And the deep meanings are not just about our brains. They also involve our bodies, our souls, our hearts. So deep meaning is far broader than just our head. And it's very easy for intellectuals to get stuck in their heads, become very arrogant about their heads.
I'm thinking that I couldn't even tell you about the most recent book that I read. I enjoy it in the moment, and it's gone. It's fleeting, that type of understanding. The teacher says that money has its place in life, and we're North Americans, so we're not wealthy, but we do have more dollars than most of world Christianity. Talk to me about wealth.
One of the challenges is that money monetizes everything. And the metric of money is easily measurable. Someone has more, someone has less. It's easily measurable of value. But just because it's an easy tool to use doesn't mean it's in fact an important tool to use. So money can get us pleasure. Lots of people use money for pleasure. But does that have deep meaning? Well, you're talking about the fleetingness, So you've been on a cruise. When you get off the ship, the cruise is over. What's left of that? There's a lot of money, but so to the same extent, the monetization of being able to do this metric doesn't give it actual ultimate value.
I confess I don't have any wisdom on this, everyone. Let's just keep going. In the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, this philosopher, he says, what you want to do to find meaning in life is remember that you're created. What does that mean for you?
I think it's those moments, for me, I remember those moments in two places. One, I want to argue that COVID confronts us with our creative, that we are created beings, that we are not ultimate, that the creation is more substantial than us and challenges us to think more deeply about who we are, that we're not in charge. But on a more positive side, those moments when I've experienced nature in a profound and deep way, I remember being in the St. Lawrence with the family in a Zodiac, and a minke whale came up 20 yards from us. You feel pretty small, pretty insignificant when this huge whale does its thing. Or the first time I saw the Rockies. Or even the joy that I felt when the crocuses came up in our yard. Those remind us that there is something much larger going on that we joyfully can be part of, join in with. Not because we have created it, but because we're invited into it by the Creator.
Yeah, I like that. Maybe we'll just leave it there. The point of our little video, everyone, is maybe like a teaser or an invitation to reflect deeper on what gives you meaning. And there's no homework, but if you want some, the book of Ecclesiastes is probably on your shelf somewhere in your home. Maybe you can take some time thinking about who you are and who God created you to be and where you find real meaning in your life. God bless everyone.